I want to start off our discussion about mental health by first looking at some important figures that you may or may not be aware of. First of all, check these numbers out. If you look closely at this graph, you'll see that places like Australia and the US have twice the rate of mental health problems than places like, say, France or Switzerland or Germany. Let's dig a little deeper. This does seem to be an American phenomenon, maybe in Australia too. But the point is, if we go back to 2015, which really wasn't that long ago, you can see only about 11% of Americans reported some kind of depression. That number is currently, as of 2023, 18%, a huge increase. And even lifetime prevalence of depression has gone up from 20% in 2015 to 29%. Something is going on in America today. Finally, I want you to think, what is driving these numbers? But one thing we know for sure that is very unique is that this seems to be a young person's disease. This problem is largely prevalent among young people. If you look at this graph, people who have any symptom of anxiety, clearly young people are much higher than people who are older, especially if they're 65 or older. However, if you look at those with severe anxiety problems, that number continues. That is to say, young people seem to be significantly more anxious, both in general, but really with even high levels of anxiety. So you have to ask the question, what is going on in society? Some sociologists from the symbolic interactionist perspective argue that mental illness, mental health is a social construct. It's not a fixed biological reality. Michel Foucault was a French philosopher who traced the history of madness to the age of reason, arguing that when science took over as the dominant paradigm, the idea of being unrealistic, unreasonable, is something that we need to separate from society. Sociologist Thomas Zaw also took along this bent, except argued that mental illness is a myth and it's a social construction, seeing psychoanalysis as more of a moral endeavor, getting people to conform to the rest of society and not a biological or a medical one. Both of these characters would argue that society decided that if people act out too much in the terms of criminality or mental health, that they should be separated from society. In the case of criminal deviance, they would go to jail. In terms of mental health deviance, and like schizophrenia and extreme forms of mental health, we'll put them in asylums. But you'll notice that in both cases, they have to be set apart from society for some reason. I want to end this point with the idea that these are just sort of perspectives, and it can be hard for us, especially if you're dealing with a mental health problem, to view them in this way. So please keep in mind that this is a perspective among many perspectives in the field of sociology and of mental health. Let me tell you a story about Laura Delano. In the book Unshrunk, A Story of Psychiatric Treatment Resistance, the author chronicles her journey from being diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the age of 13 and undergoing years of intensive psychiatric treatment, to ultimately tapering off all psychiatric medications. She critiques the overuse of prescription drugs in the mental health industry and now supports and advises individuals seeking to deprescribe themselves under her nonprofit Inner Compass initiative. Delano's story has ignited discussions around the risks of over-medication, particularly in the psychiatric care. I want to remind you, symbolic interaction is all about meaning-making, but meaning-making is not created equal. Some people have more influence over meaning-making than others, usually high-status people, and in different times in history, people have more influence over meaning-making than others. In the past, perhaps religious institutions had a stronger impact on the mental health field. Now, clearly things are more housed under the medical field. But even that is socially constructed. Let me explain. Let me ask you, have you ever seen an ad for a new medication and thought, wait, is that a medical condition now? You're witnessing the power of medication in action. Long before Delano's work, sociologists have been talking about the medicalization of deviance. And this refers to how mental health problems have increasingly fallen under the domain of medicine. This isn't a neutral process. It's driven by powerful forces in multiple institutions. Power and authority of medical profession has been huge. Most of us take it for granted that doctors have the prestige and power that they have, but 200 years ago, they didn't have nearly the influence that they have today. There's also been activities of social movements and interest groups that have been part of it. And these advocacy groups come from a lot of different places, but once they're in place, they can make movements and impact the medical industry as well. Professional groups and activities have been part of this. Pharmaceutical companies pushing different diagnoses so that they can sell drugs to solve those problems. Medicalization profoundly shapes our understanding of distress, shifting it from a moral failing or a social problem to a medical one. While this can reduce stigma and open doors to care, it also raises critical questions about who benefits from these definitions, whether complex social issues are being oversimplified, and if they're losing sight of non-medical solutions. This process influences everything from research funding to public perception, highlighting the immense social power wielded by the medical establishment and related industries. Consider the shift in understanding of alcoholism. Historically, it has been considered a moral failing or lack of willpower. Through medicalization, it is now widely recognized as a disease, leading to different treatment approaches and public perception. Similarly, the growing recognition of burnout as medical condition rather than simply a personal failing is another example of medicalization. It's not to say that these shouldn't be under the medical rubric. It just helps us to stop for a moment and think about how these things can be defined, who's controlling that dialogue, and ultimately who's benefiting from those definitions. Regardless of who has the power to define mental health, we continue to have asylums set aside for people who have severe mental health problems. Irving Goffman was one of the first social scientists to spend a lot of time in these institutions and sort of talk about what is the culture or subculture of these kind of institutions. I don't want to go into it in detail. Your book covers it more than we have time. But people, even in these types of asylums, have agency and the ability to define and control their situations and define and control themselves. The stress process is probably one of the most useful paradigms for you of this entire class. With the stress process, hopefully you'll get some tools you can use to help you lead a healthy life, at least mentally healthy life. The stress process is a particularly important paradigm for me because I used it in my dissertation, part of which was headed by a man named Leonard Pearlin. Leonard Pearlin was at the University of Maryland before he passed away, and he agreed to be on my dissertation committee. So I know this paradigm very well, but I also know it because I think it's really important for you to understand it. Now, there are many other versions of this in other fields with different names and different people associated with it, but this is the one I know the most, so I'm going to focus on this. But I want you to think of stress kind of like a rubber band. And some of us are born with a loose rubber band. We both have a personality and we live in an environment. We have our food and clothing. We're doing pretty well. We're not really high stress. Some of us, on the other hand, are a little tighter. We're our personality, we're a little more uptight. We get stressed a little easier. Or we grow up in a neighborhood that's falling apart. We are in poverty. We're not sure where the next meal's coming from and so forth. So we're starting the game a little tighter. And the things that society throws at us, the things that we throw at ourselves, can make that rubber band tighter and tighter or looser and looser. And we're going to talk about the things we know about that rubber band in your life. From the social structure and personality perspective, one of the things that stresses us out are negative life events. They could be significant things like the loss of a job. It could be the loss of a loved one, for instance. They can also be little things, annoyances that occur on a day-to-day basis. So we call these smaller things that happen to us chronic strains. They're persistent, ongoing problems. So we have some strains that are strains related to just people annoying us, and that doesn't happen on a regular basis. But it's when it becomes chronic and it's day-to-day, that's when it really, really impacts us. So in that sense, the stress process tries to understand how the quality of stressful event as well as the quantity of stressful events add up to lead to a mental health problem in the future. Here, I just want to point out that our social statuses from society, our race, class, and gender all contribute to these chronic forces that are impinging on us on a day-to-day basis. In some cases, helping us, in other cases, hurting us. The good news is society also gives us tools to help buffer the stresses that come upon us as well. They include usually some kind of social support, usually referring to friends and family, or other forms of support that can also be from the government in the form of assistance. They can include emotional support, instrumental support, information support, appraisal support. These are all ways to help us cope with those stressful things that come to us, whether they're chronic, coming from society, or just discrete things that happen to us on a day-to-day basis. I want to also say that we have personal resources such as self-esteem, mastery, and sense of mattering. And I want to emphasize mastery, which also is a measure from Len Pearlin, that shows that our sense that we believe we can achieve the things we set out to do has as the same or more power than, say, self-esteem in helping us buffer the impact of negative life events on things like depression and anxiety. I love this image of a friendship bench because it brings together the worlds of social structure and personality, which is where the stress process is housed, in symbolic interaction we talked about earlier. This comes from Zimbabwe, in which there's a dire need for mental health services. And one psychiatrist who knew that he was not able to cover all the services where he was located decided to do some training of some local women to provide mental health services in the community. And those people that needed more help than what they could provide, they can refer, but it helps to filter all of the mental health problems that exist in the community through another means. And this is important for our discussion because we talked about the medicalization of mental health. And in some cases, people do need that medical help. In other cases, they just need someone to talk to. And so I give credit to this psychiatrist in Zimbabwe for sort of thinking outside of the box, outside of the medical box, to find alternative ways to help people without discounting the medical field altogether. I'm going to bring this lecture together by bringing in actually symbolic interaction with group processes. I want to focus on symbolic interaction because I want to talk about modified labeling theory of mental health. Modified labeling theory, if you remember, labeling theory focuses on criminal deviance and how that becomes part of someone's identity. Well, mental health researchers have extended that logic to mental health, such that if someone gets labeled with a mental health problem, that might cause stigma and impact people's relationships with other people and their sense of self above and beyond what they think of themselves. That is to say, they're labeled from the outside and it impacts their thoughts, feelings, and behavior about themselves. This is very much related to status characteristics theory. If you recall, we bring our statuses from society into group interactions. And some scholars from the group processes area have studied how that stigma of being mentally ill could impact relationships in groups, just like a status characteristics of race, class, and gender can impact those interactions. So they're coming from different perspectives. That is to say, modified labeling theory is from symbolic interaction, status characteristics theory, and mental health is a status characteristic. But they kind of do the same thing. But you just have to remember that they really talk about things in a somewhat different way. And they also research this area very differently. I hope one thing is clear to you in this lecture, that well-being is a complex tapestry woven from biological predispositions, psychological processes, and crucially for our discussion, a rich social fabric. I'm hoping that by applying sociological theories, you'll gain a more nuanced understanding of mental health in society and will help you in your own journey.